All right, so good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first session. You'll see staff next to my name and any of the folks moderating here today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via the chat. I will be keeping an eye on it for the duration of this session. Today we have with us Don Feeney. He's going to be presenting on the implications of the 2021 National Survey on Gambling Attitudes and Experience. Don is here with us today. He's a policy research consultant to the National Council on Problem Gambling. Don, we're delighted to have you with us today, and I'll be on mute, but you go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Okay. Thank you, and good morning. And I am delighted that such a large number of people decided to come in for a morning session that is, to be frank, is going to be pretty data heavy. And yes, you are going to see numbers, and there are going to be a lot of them. I will try not to be too much of a data nerd to the degree that I can help it, actually, because I actually am a data nerd. But I hope that will not that will not get in our way. So, what is the NGAGE study? The NGAGE study was begun in 2018, and it was at a time when sports betting had not yet expanded in the US, but we could see it coming. It was after the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court decision had come down, and states were now trying to come to grips with what to do with this newfound power. And the National Council decided that some baseline data would be a very, very good thing to have, so that as time went on, we could assess the effect of the expansion of sports betting that we were certain was going to follow. And they were able to obtain funding, a very generous grant from the Entain Foundation that allowed us to take that baseline survey in 2018. November of 2018, which was a time when sports betting was operational in precisely two states, Nevada and New Jersey. And we were able to, in 2018, do a very large-scale survey, certainly the largest that I had ever been involved in, which involved actually a total of about 28,000 respondents nationwide. And we started with a base sample of 3,000 for the national sample, which is what our national conclusions were based on. But we also had enough that we could have a sample of 500 for every state in the country plus the District of Columbia. So we could look at how states differed prior to sports betting legalization, and for many states we would then have again some baseline data. Cut to 2021. April of 2021, we decided that it was time to take another survey, and unfortunately we did not have the same level of funding, and we could not do the state-by-state data. We could do, however, a sample of 2,000 nationwide. So we had a little bit of a reduction of sample size nationally from 3,000 to 2,000. And that affected a couple of things that we had asked in 2018 and that we would have liked to ask in 2021, but we're not quite, we wouldn't have a big enough sample for that data to be really reliable. But we do have now some data from the time when now many states have implemented or about to implement sports betting. We also, and this was certainly not something that was planned in 2018, we gave us some insight into what the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on gambling has been. and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So you can see what the survey included questions on gambling participation. What types of gambling do you do? With a lot of questions about sports betting, fantasy sports betting. We had some questions about problematic behavior, although it was not a prevalence survey.
Yeah, activity
Um,
and discussion.
Yeah. We did not have enough of a sample size, I think, really to make it to do what I would consider to be an adequate
And then you gotta give them one.
prevalence study. I'm hearing some background noise. If there's someone who could please mute their microphone, that would be appreciated. Thank you. And there were also some methodological issues with prevalence studies that they have been found to be, I think, increasingly unreliable, particularly when done using an internet-based survey, which is what this was. I should mention the survey was taken by Ipsos, which is one of the world's 3 or 4 largest public opinion research firms. So for them, doing a survey on this scale of this type, they also actually have a separate gambling research division. This was an absolute piece of cake for them, although the questions were designed by and the analysis was done by and the report was written by NCPG. Ipsos had consulted with us on the questionnaire and actually collected the data on the survey and provided the data files. We included some questions about positive play. And then we had a number of questions about people's beliefs and opinions about problem gambling. And for the most part, we were able to keep the survey consistent from 2018 to 2021. I want to start with a few, just a few items from the 2018 survey, specifically about New York. So you can see some cases, some ways in which New York was the same as or differed from the rest of the country. And these are going to be kind of a random, no, not really random, but no, not a terribly well organized discussion of gambling in New York. That would be another whole 1-hour presentation. This intro slide for setting up New York, you'll notice, well, I didn't choose one of the usual New York icons, Niagara Falls, the Statue of Liberty, Finger Lakes, whatever. A few of you might recognize this building, though. This is the birthplace of the poet Walt Whitman, which is in West Hills, New York. I chose this because, one, Whitman is one of my my favorite poets, and I wanted to be able to bring some poetry into the presentation. But I chose it more because I actually grew up about 1 mile north of this building, enough to know that this particular camera angle is shielding the view of the Walt Whitman shopping mall, which is pretty much just behind the birthplace. And if that didn't have Whitman spinning very rapidly in his grave, I don't know what would. I can think of nothing more antithetical to the spirit of Walt Whitman than a giant shopping mall. And I am also a proud graduate of Walt Whitman High School, which is located about half a mile west of the birthplace. And so it gives me the opportunity to say, go Wildcats. If we look at what people in the US and New York did in what they gambled on in the year prior to the 2018 survey, you will see that, and I'm sure this will come as a great shock to you, New Yorkers like to gamble more than people overall in the rest of the country do. Overall, participating in any form of gambling, New Yorkers were about 10 percentage points more likely to gamble than people in the country overall, about 83 to 73% margin. They're more likely to gamble on the lottery. They're more likely to buy raffle tickets. They are more likely to spend money at a casino, to play on a gaming machine, to play card games, even pull tabs or break opens, bingo, and we go even to the more obscure forms. Every single one of those, New Yorkers were more likely to gamble than people in the rest of the country, and I can see the shock registering on your face from that. I mean, it was actually something of a shock to me when I moved from New York to Minnesota and found that, geez, not everybody knew where the neighborhood bookie was. I couldn't conceive of that kind of world. I'm going to cut now just to sports betting. Yes, New Yorkers were more likely to bet on sports than people in the rest of the country were, but I found it really interesting that well, there we go. How much that was because of young adults. Older adults, you see, the margin between New York and the rest of the country really isn't that great. But look at this, it's an 18-point difference for 25 to 34-year-olds. 18-point difference for 18 to 24-year-olds. It's something about younger adults in New York that makes them more likely that they want to want to bet on sports than people in the rest of the country do. And you can make of that what you will, and you can probably interpret that better than I can, but I just thought that was really interesting to point out. Gaming machines. Slot machines, basically, or video lottery terminals, whatever you happen to call them in any particular place. Some of you I know aren't particularly familiar with this form of graph. Let me just give a quick explanation. This means, for example, that of the 50 states plus the District of Columbia that we included on this survey, in 8 of those 51 jurisdictions, between 18 and 23% of the adults gambled, had said yes, they had played a slot machine in the past year. Likewise, in 9 of those states, between 23 and 28%. No surprise, Nevada is by far the #1 state for slot machine betting, where about roughly 3 out of every 5 Nevadans had said they played a slot machine in the past year. My reaction to that was, that's all. But if you go down here, the next 2, it's a pretty big gap, but tied for second for slot machine participation. Arizona, I think, which has its proximity to Nevada, probably has a lot to do with that, and New York. A couple of the positive play indicators. We were not able to ask the problematic play indicators on a state-by-state basis. It's the 500 in each state was not big enough. But the positive play indicators, these are what are called the personal responsibility questions on the positive play questionnaire. And here you see that, yeah, New Yorkers were consistently slightly less likely to agree with these positive play indicators, and we would like them to agree with all these, but it's not a big difference. So there doesn't seem to be anything particularly going on there for these 4 indicators. We look at the gambling literacy indicators on positive play, and we see, again, pretty much the same thing. New Yorkers are less likely to gamble in what we would call a positive manner to have positive beliefs on this. With something like, gambling is not a good way to make money. But it's not a big difference. 4% less likely to say gambling is not a good way to make money. And that I would put in the, yes, we want to see that. We want to see more people agree with that statement, but there's nothing unique about New York in that aspect. And again, here this is an interesting one. We asked people, if your state were to legalize sports betting, how important is it to set aside revenues to treat people who develop gambling problems? And New Yorkers were among the most likely in the country to say, yes, the state should set aside money for gambling treatment if we're going to do sports betting, which to me is a very, very good thing. Likewise, if someone close to me had a gambling problem, I would know where to get them help. And New Yorkers and Nevadans were one of the 2 most likely states in the country for people to agree with that statement. And all I can say on that is, good job, New York Council, of helping to make people aware of that. The government should do more to help people with a gambling addiction. New Yorkers were, again, among the highest in the country of people agreeing with that statement, saying, yes, we want our state or the national government, whatever, whomever, to do more to help people with a gambling addiction. And again, I have to say, good job, New York Council, in that regard. It's kind of an odd collection of jurisdictions in that top level: District of Columbia, Florida, New York, and Rhode Island. Which, other than being on the eastern seaboard, states for places that have, I think, absolutely nothing in common.
Don, if I can ask you a question
Sure.
before we move forward.
Yeah.
Does the US average include New York State, or is the New
Yes.
York State numbers separated from the
No,
national?
that includes New York.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So now I want to get to the 2021 survey, which, as I mentioned, does not include data for each individual state, unfortunately. But we had some key questions that we wanted to address on the 2021 survey. Has the popularity of gambling changed in the 2.5 years since we'd taken the previous survey? And two big things happened: the expansion of sports betting and the COVID pandemic. How did that change the overall popularity of gambling? What types of gambling have become more or less popular? What's been the effect of restricting gambling or legalizing gambling on different forms? What was the pandemic effect? What was the effect of legalizing sports betting? Are more people gambling online? And I can think of a few reasons why that might have happened. Is there a relationship? This was an interesting one. Someone, when we developed the questionnaire, said, let's ask people about their investment practices and see if there's a relationship between investing and gambling, particularly risky investing and risky gambling. Who is at the highest risk for gambling problems? And finally, does the public understand or stigmatize problem gambling? Start with the first one. Has the popularity of gambling changed? And the answer is overall, no, not much. But, if we look at the overall frequency, how many times, and this is an imperfect measure of gambling frequency, but when we asked them about their individual gambling activities, did they say nationally, 24% in 2018 said they gambled on at least one activity on a weekly basis or more often. And that had changed to 27% by 2021. That is certainly within the margin of error of these surveys. In fact, all of these, basically, we really saw no difference, no change in gambling frequency in the 2.5 years since the first survey was taken, which is a little bit of surprise given all that that happened during that time. However, we did see a change in the number of activities that people participated in. So the number who said they hadn't gambled, didn't gamble at all in the previous year really didn't change. But look what happens when we get out here. A lot more than twice as many people. Now, 1 in 5 American adults say they gambled on 11 different activities or more. And that's a pretty amazing jump. I think I know why that happened, and we'll get to that coming up. But keep that in mind, because I think that was overall pretty significant. So what types of gambling have become more or less popular? You see, anti-gambling really hasn't changed very much. Lottery gambling really didn't change much. Raffle went down. Raffle participation went down. That's not a surprise. During for the pandemic, a lot of the organizations that sponsor raffles, schools, charitable organizations, or whatever, just weren't doing raffles. Some of them were just totally shut down, or they weren't holding the events where people where they might be selling raffle tickets. Casino participation didn't change a bit, which I thought was interesting, given that for part of that time, and most of the casinos were shut down. Again, slot machine play didn't change. Card games, not really. Pull tabs, not really. Bingo was up. That's a long time trend. We've been seeing bingo participation steadily rising in the country for a number of years now. And the interesting thing there is that it's very heavily young adult oriented. Bingo is no longer the granny game. I'm not entirely sure it ever was, but it certainly isn't now. There are many more young adults playing bingo than there are senior citizens. An increase in sports betting, 20 to 26%, which when you translate that into numbers of people, that is really, really significant. Again, you say, okay, of course, sports betting was legalized in a lot more states over that time, but that's not necessarily, as we'll see, that's not necessarily the reason why. And fantasy sports, whoa, way up, 17% to 24%. Here's the big one: online gambling. Did you make any kind of wager online? From 15% in 2018 to 25% in 2021. That's like a 75% increase. It's incredible. And then some things you wouldn't expect to see increase.
Oh.
Horse racing, up way.
Oh, Don. Oh, hey, Don, can you unmute your camera, please? I'm sorry. I don't know what happened there.
Okay. Yeah. So this enormous, I mentioned this enormous increase in sports betting, things like roulette and craps. And again, wait a minute, weren't the casinos closed for a lot of that past year? Why did we see this big increase in that kind of participation? I have some theories, and we will get to those. Yeah, I mentioned these areas. It's kind of the less popular forms of gambling where we saw these very large increases. And we translate this into number of people. Basically, we saw 15 million more people in the US betting on sports in 2021 than there were in 2018. About 17 million more people betting on fantasy sports. And that's interesting because, you know, the legalization legislation that was in play all over the place did not affect fantasy sports, but yet that number was way, way up. And online wagering, 26 million more people betting online in 21 than there were in 2018. And you say, wait a minute, but online wagering is still largely illegal in most of the country. There are only 2 states where you can legally bet online on casino games: Pennsylvania and New Jersey. There are a couple of others. There are a couple where you can buy some lottery tickets online. There are some that have legalized sports betting where you can do your sports betting online, but it's still online. It's still not widespread, and yet you're seeing this incredible growth in online wagering. All right, so what's been the effect of legalizing forms of gambling? The answer is, I don't think really all that much. Look what happened here in sports betting. Yes, a lot more people are gambling on sports, but the participation in sports betting is just about the same whether you live in a state where it's legal, 25%, or where it's not, 26%. So the legalization by itself really didn't seem to have any effect on sports gambling participations. And likewise, you see fantasy sports. Not much difference between the places where sports betting is legal and where it's not. So the legalization by itself really didn't seem to affect very much. And likewise, remember, we saw this big growth in online gambling. Here, you know, whether it has to do with sports betting, not really. But the legalization, there wasn't much legalization of online wagering over that period. And what this leads me to the conclusion that legalization is pretty much technicality. I don't think a lot of people know or care whether the gambling they're doing, be it online or on, you know, or somehow betting on sports, is legal. It's out there. They can find it. They can do it. I mean, finding an online casino, you know, to anyone who has an internet account, takes about 5 minutes, if that. Finding a way to bet online on sports, whether or not you live in a state where it's legal, again, is a trivial exercise in internet navigation. So the legalization by itself doesn't seem to amount to much, and I'll go into some more detail with that where it comes to sports. But I want to talk now about the pandemic. How did gambling change during the pandemic? Well, we asked people, so during the pandemic, and this is self-perception, did you gamble more? Did you gamble less? Did you gamble about the same? See, about half the public says they gambled less during the pandemic. As you would expect, people might have some financial stress. A lot of gambling establishments were closed during much of the pandemic. About a third saying they gamble the same, and about 1 in 5 saying that they gambled more. Well, let's look at that compared along with their indicators of problematic play. As I mentioned, we did not do a prevalence study. We asked about 4 different indicators of problematic play, though, and those are the items that are found either on the brief biosocial gambling screen, which is a 3-question questionnaire, or the lie bet questionnaire, 2 very brief screening instruments that are in wide use. 2 questions on the lie bet scale, one of them between the 2 overlaps. So we had 4 questions that we asked people. And we said, all right, we looked at who answered yes to one or more of those indicators. So they did it at least one of these problematic indicators, like, did you lie about your gambling? Did you feel stressed when you tried to cut down on your gambling? Did you do at least once, did you experience that? And we see the people who said they gambled more during the pandemic overwhelmingly were experiencing some potential problematic play in the past year. Almost 90% were having some potential problems with their gambling. And the interesting thing was about half of the people who said they gambled less during the pandemic were also experiencing some potentially problematic behavior. And you say, well, wait a minute, they're gambling less. Shouldn't their gambling problems be reduced, not increased, compared to people who said they gambled the same during the pandemic? Well, you think about it a little bit and say, well, wait a minute, if I'm gambling less during the pandemic, then maybe I am more likely to be stressed when I try to cut down. Maybe I would feel like, oh, geez, I really want to be gambling more. Maybe it's because I'm gambling less because of financial stress, and financial stress equals other kinds of stressful feelings or behavior. And therefore, the fact that I'm gambling less, wait a minute, I shouldn't be gambling at all, maybe. And that's a cause of stress. So, it actually makes some sense that, cutting down on gambling can be stressful and can lead to some potentially problematic play. Whereas the people who are gambling about the same, hey, business as usual, not quite so much stress. And of course, the pandemic by itself was, as I think we all know, inherently stressful. And there could be some indicators of stress that people were attributing to their gambling and may actually have just had to do with overall pandemic-related stress. Now, if we look at what may be more severe stress, who said yes, they have experienced all 4 of the problematic indicators? Again, half of the people who said they gambled more said yes to all 4 of them. 1 in 4 of the people who gambled less, and only 1 in 10 of people who said they were gambling about that same. So you see that same pattern. Now here we'll see each of the 4 indicators, and these are people who said they had experiencing these problematic behaviors many times, which means they probably really are having some difficulty. To some of these, yeah, I said, I lied about my gambling once. It's really, who cares? If you're lying about it a lot, then maybe there's some more serious indication. And we see that same trend, but particularly the people who said they gambled more, those 20% of the public who said they were gambling more, were likely to be experiencing some significant distress. This is one that amazes me. 21% said that many times they relied on others to pay their gambling, their debts or bills because of gambling. Now, again, I have to, it's possible that was a long question. People may have just said, oh yeah, I had to rely on other people to pay my debts during the pandemic because I lost my job or whatever, and missed the because of gambling, or maybe it wasn't because of gambling, it was just because of their overall financial situation. So that number of, the true gambling related number, there may be a little lower than that, but boy, that's still an absolutely enormous number. And again, the people gambling more likely to, a lot more likely to say they lied. Here you see, felt restless or irritable and they tried to cut down. Yeah, the people are gambling more, but again, you see a fairly significant number of the people who were gambling less said, yeah, many times that felt restless or irritable when they were trying to cut down, that gambling less was actually a stressful activity for them. And likewise, the what we call the tolerance indicators, you see that same pattern where it wasn't an issue for people whose gambling didn't change. For some, it was for some of the people a significant issue for people who were who gambled less, and then a pretty substantial number, 15%, for people who were gambling more. Now, who are the people who were gambling more? They were young adults. And this is a pattern that we're going to see throughout all kinds of indicators in this presentation. You'll see that this, a lot more play, problematic play, less positive play for people between the ages of 18 and 44, and then that number drops off. But it was the young adults who were increasing their play during the pandemic. Again, probably the people who are most likely to be financially affected by the pandemic, may have lost their job, had to cut back on hours, whatever, may be having ones who are most likely to be having childcare issues, just having the kids home from school all the time. And so it's not surprising that that was an issue that was an age group, that 18 to 44, that was experiencing a lot of pandemic related stress, and that would show up in their gambling. Okay, now let's do sports betting. I mentioned before that there really didn't seem to be any change that had anything to do with the legalization of sports betting. And we see that in all kinds of indicators relating to sports betting. How about how often are you sports betting? Are you gambling on sports? Is a little bit of an indicator of a sense that people who lived in states where sports betting became legal were doing it a little more frequently. But those numbers are not, it's not an overwhelming difference by any means. It's only about a 5% difference. So again, legalization didn't seem to have that big an effect. How about what type of sports bets are they making? Are they making the within-game bets? Or are they just doing the win-lose kinds of bets? No difference. Ditto for how they're making sports bets. Are they doing it on an online sports book, or are they going to a brick and mortar sports book, or are they going to a bookie? I had hoped that in particular with the legalization of sports betting, you would see the bookie numbers start to come down, but it didn't really seem to be the case. So again, the legalization of sports betting didn't seem to have that much effect. Size of wager. Again, no particularly big difference. Maybe there was a little indication that people in the states without legal sports betting, when they made a bet, and that may have something to do with frequency, I don't know, were making slightly larger bets, but not a big deal. Here's the big one. How about problematic play? Here I'm focusing on the people who said they experienced these feelings many times. No, legalization of sports betting really didn't seem to have an effect. And I think that is going to surprise a lot of people. It certainly surprised me. I was expecting we'd see some effect there, but the legalization did not result in an epidemic of increased problematic gambling behavior, which is good. And again, here I look at the people who really severe problems. They said they were answering yes to all 4 of those indicators. Whether or not you lived in a state with legal sports betting didn't seem to make any difference whatsoever. We look at positive play, the honesty and control measures, in particular in this one. I felt in control of my gambling. No difference between legalized sports betting and non-legalized sports betting. Now, depending upon whose side of the sports betting legalization argument you believed at the time, this is good news for the people who expected that sports betting legalizing sports betting would lead to an epidemic of problem gambling. No indication that it did. Bad news for people who said, well, if you legalize sports betting, we're taking people away from these offshore gambling sites, and therefore there'll be less problematic play. That didn't happen either. Now, my caution on that is none of these happened yet. We are still in the very early stages of widespread legal sports betting in the US. And, if we give this another few years, it is entirely possible that these conclusions will change. How they will change, I don't know, but it gets back to legalization for most people is really a technicality. Legalization is not, for those who are thinking that, if we legalize, we'll get people away from the offshore sites. Legalization was not a panacea. Likewise, I think the people who said legalization will lead to disastrous increases in problematic gambling. Legalization was not a disaster in and of itself either. And so the legalization, the effect on problem gambling, there are plenty of reasons to oppose legalization of sports betting. There are reasons to support legalization of sports betting, but the effect on problem gambling does not seem to be one of them. Here, I think is the key. What's happened to online gambling? We asked people what types of, they said they had gambled online, and remember that number increased from 15% of adults to 25% of adults in a 2.5-year period, which is a very large increase. What types of gambling have you done online in the past year? And from 2021, from 2018 to 2021, you saw some growth in online sports betting. Actually, something of a decline in fantasy sports betting, which surprised me. Some growth, 4% growth in poker playing, but not much. Slots really didn't change. Here's where you see the big increases, though, in some of these table games, blackjack, roulette, craps. A lot more people playing those online. Bingo, a lot more people playing bingo online. Not surprising, a lot of the bingo halls were shut down during the pandemic. Raffles, not really a change. Esports, basically, which is betting on video game play. I think a very big emerging trend that I will not get into here, but is worthy probably of a discussion in and of itself. And horse racing. We went from 13% of online gamblers betting on a horse race in 2018 to 21% in 2021. Virtual sports, that's basically something like, simulated sports events like Madden. If you think Madden football, basketball, whatever, that's what virtual sports is. But this is why we saw that increase in horse racing overall at a time when people couldn't go to tracks, or in table games, roulette, etc., when people couldn't go to casinos. They were doing it online. They go to an online gambling site to play something that they expect, poker, something they expected to play, and oh, hey, look, I can wager on roulette. That might be fun to try, and I can try it in an environment when people aren't sitting there judging my roulette play at the table, or I can play online poker without or blackjack without people looking and saying, hey, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. Much less threatening. And oh, look, I can actually bet on a horse race, and not just a horse race in my own state. I can bet on a horse race anywhere in the country, which you can do, and that's actually legal. There's a carve out for horse racing, specifically in the federal internet gambling legislation. So I think a lot of people discovered that there were all these things during the pandemic, that there were all these things that they could gamble on online, and that led to this increase in types of gambling that had been fading for years, like a lot of the casino table games, and like in particular horse racing. It's not as good for a track as having bodies there in the seats, but hey, given what they've been experiencing, I suspect most of them would take that, and that's why a lot of racetracks actually continued running races at a time when they could not have anybody in the stands.
Hey, Don,
who's doing this online game? Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have a couple quick relevant questions.
Sure.
First, we had a question a little while ago that was, what is the role of gender in sports betting? And then another question we have was who benefits from legalization? So I just wanted to throw those out there.
Who benefits from legalization is something I'm going to pass on that one because that's not within the scope of the survey, and I'd just be shooting my mouth off if I tried to answer that. And you can get enough of that for free on your own time. Who's betting on gender on sports betting? About 2-to-1 male to female,
Okay.
and that hasn't changed. Although I mean, both sports betting for both men and women did increase in the 2.5 years, but consistently.
Okay. And then one other question was, folks wanted some more clarification between stock market gambling being included or not included in here.
It was not included in this portion of it. We asked that as a separate set of questions, and I'll be getting to that in a little bit, but we did not count that as a form of gambling.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, who's gambling online? Again, it's the young adults. And we see this giant fall off when we get to the age of 45. That's probably not a surprise to anyone. Very few seniors gambling online because, hey, we're all, well, we're not totally technologically illiterate, but enough of us are, we still, us baby boomers prefer the old-fashioned ways. And here by gender, online gambling is pretty heavily male dominated, and again that goes back to what are they doing? You're betting on sports, you're betting on poker, and it's pretty much the male dominated forms of gambling that are being done heavily online. Again, we're now here. What do we know about gambling and investments? We ask separately about what types. We ask people first, did you hold any investments such as bonds, stocks, mutual funds? And only about 1/3 of the American public does. 2/3 have nothing, don't hold any investments, although they may in non-directed investments, like, they have a pension fund that has investments, of course, or something to that effect. But there are only 1/3 who actually own and manage in investments. All right, you do. How regularly do they trade? 1 in 5 said they trade about less than once a year. But also 1 in 5 who said they gamble weekly or more often. And these are the people that I wanted to pay particular attention to. Because they are the ones that, the speculation always been that if you're doing frequent investing, you may be having some related problems with that. Now, we didn't ask them about problems directly connected with their investment, but we also then could say, does how regularly they trade or whether they trade have anything to do with how frequently they gamble? And the answer is very much yes. People who held investments were much more likely to be gambling. Well, than people who did not have investments. It was almost 9 in 10 of people who had some type of investment said they also gambled in the past year on one of our things that we usually consider to be gambling. And 94%, almost everyone who said they traded weekly was also doing some traditional conventional gambling. So there is a relationship between propensity to invest and propensity to gamble. And when we look at how many gambling activities they are, we compared that with the people who said they were trading weekly or more, these frequent investors. Look at this. Half of the frequent investors were also gambling on 11 or more gambling activities. There's an enormous correlation there. And the people who were trading frequently were much more likely to be experiencing some problematic play and experiencing it many times. So there seems to be a relationship between frequent trading on investments and problematic gambling. We look at specific indicators, or 4 specific indicators, and we're seeing a lot of that with people who are gambling, who are trading 1 or 3 times a month, also experiencing some problematic behavior relating to their gambling on every single one of these indicators. And one of the things that says to me is, if you are treating somebody from their gambling, ask about their investment practices as well, because there's a pretty good chance that that's carrying over to the way that they are managing their finances. Likewise, if you're talking to somebody who is concerned about their investments, ask about their gambling, because there is so definitely a relationship here. Who's at the greatest risk of gambling-related problems? Doesn't really seem to say, oh, it's got, it's going to be poor people. Not really. That there doesn't seem to be all that much difference based on household income with their likelihood to be gambling problematically. But by age, there's an enormous difference. Who is at the most risk of, who's showing the most likelihood of problematic play? Young adults. But also look at how much that changed from 2018 to 2021. 3 out of 4 of the 18 to 24-year-olds, 7 out of 10 of the 25 to 34-year-olds who were gambling were seeing some indication of problematic play. Compared to seniors, whereas, at most 1 of 10 of seniors showing some indication of problematic play. Seniors are not a high-risk population. High risk is concentrated very heavy in these young adults. And again, notice how that jumps when you go from 35 to 44 to 45 to 54-year-olds. It's under 45 is where problematic play is heavily concentrated. And again, we look at, they said many times, particularly some serious problems. Again, we see that switch being flipped once you hit the age of 45. Young adults are where the problems are. 3 or 4, they said three or four of our 4 indicators. Again, it's all focused on the young adults. Do you agree with this statement? Strongly agree with this statement. Gambling is not a good way to make money. Look at this. Under 45, you only have about 1 in 4 saying, yeah, gambling isn't a good way to make money. Now, when we go to 45 and older, it's half saying gambling's not a good way to make money, and we'd like to see that number a lot higher than that. But again, you notice it's 3 and 4 of our seniors who strongly agree with that statement. But again, it's just here is where there are the misconceptions in this 18 to 45-year-old age group. By gender, we're seeing, yes, we do see more problematic play in men than we do in women. And if I were to break this down, it's, young men is where our problems are. And sports bettors. Sports bettors are much more likely to show problematic play than people who bet but not bet on sports. Again, that has nothing to do with legalization, but sports betting is pretty highly correlated with who your problematic players are. And I'm going to look at this another way. This past slide, this is how many people who bet on sports. 10% of people who bet on sports said that many times they felt that they needed to gamble more for the same feeling of excitement, tolerance. If we look at this another way, what percentage of people who said they needed to gamble more for the same feeling of excitement many times were sports bettors? 3 out of 4. 96% of the people who said that many times they relied on others to pay their debts or bills because of their gambling, 96% were betting on sports. 86% who were lying to hide their gambling were betting on sports. It's almost to the point where you say, you want to know if somebody's experiencing a problem with their gambling, just ask them, first, are you a young adult? And if so, did you bet on sports? And, and you're going to hit almost all of your problematic gamblers that way. Now, the caution I have on that is also this problematic play is very strongly associated with how many different forms of gambling you bet on. And people who bet on sports are also very likely to be betting on other forms of gambling too, particularly the forms of gambling that we consider to be the riskiest, the skill games, the games where there's some perception of skill. And again, it seems to come back to young adults. Does the public understand problem gambling? And I've got to wrap up here. I'll go through this pretty quickly. The quick answer is no, but also in many aspects, but also it did not change very much from 2018 to 2021. How likely are these things to cause, are all of these indicators to cause a gambling problem? The things that I'm concerned about here, 3 and 4 say not having enough willpower. Well, again, if it's not willpower, is that something where you need to go to a trained treatment professional to help you get willpower? No, this is something that you just suck it up, get some willpower. Having an addictive personality, 4 and 5 say that's going to cause a gambling problem. The problem being that there is no such thing as an addictive personality. Where do we see, experiencing a traumatic event, less than half, or genetics or medical condition, again, a little less than half is not, what that tells me is there's not a lot of widespread public acceptance of the medical model on problem gambling. We asked the question, are people with a gambling problem unlikely to recover or get better? These are numbers that I would like, these disagree numbers, I would really like to see a lot higher. A third of the people said, basically, I don't know. Does treatment help? Do people get better from a gambling problem? And we have 1 in 4 saying no. People with a gambling problem don't recover or get better. Well, if you're in one of these 3 categories, how likely are you to refer someone to treatment if you don't think that treatment helps somebody get better? If people aren't likely to get better, and that's related to this question. When you hear recovery, as in this person is in recovery for a gambling addiction, what does that recovery mean to you? Well, it's 30% said it means that they're abstinent. Another 38% means they have their gambling under control. But here we have 46% and saying that person is trying to. It means that they're trying to stop. And again, there are a couple of things here where you could answer yes to more than one. They're trying to stop, which again I think leads into that they're unlikely to recover. If when they say they're recovered, that only means that they're trying to stop, but can't. Smaller numbers saying mental illness. That's probably a good thing because I think that's an indication of stigma. And now this is an interesting one. We asked, do you consider this to be gambling? And wait a minute, I consider every one of these things to be gambling. And I think most of you do too, but 1 in 4 people have said, do you consider roulette or craps play to be gambling? 1 in 4 answered no, they don't consider it to be gambling. 1 in 4 said sports betting isn't gambling. Half said fantasy sports isn't gambling. The fantasy sports lobby won on that. They were claiming, that, well, no, you shouldn't make, that's not a legalization question because it's not gambling. And it turns out a lot of people agree with them. Only a third said frequently trading stocks, bonds, etc. was gambling. But, again, if you don't consider this to be gambling, are you going to pay attention to somebody talking about a gambling problem? Maybe not. If it's not gambling, can you have if what you do isn't gambling, can you have a problem with your gambling? But again, here I just chose betting on sports. Do you consider that to be gambling? It's the young adults who are saying, no, it's not. The people most likely to be doing betting on sports saying, well, that's not gambling. And maybe we need to be doing some work on perception there. Yes, it is gambling, and yes, you can get into a problem with it. Older adults tend to believe that yes, that is gambling. And this also here I correlated, do you consider betting on slots or gaming machines to be gambling with whether or not you do it? And the people who never bet on a slot machine say, yes, of course that's gambling. But the people who are betting weekly or more on a slot machine or betting 1 to 3 times a month, fewer than half of them, like 1 in 3 even, are saying, yeah, that's gambling. And I'd love to know if they don't think that betting on slot machines is gambling, and particularly if they're doing it weekly, what do they consider to be gambling? And I've always said that the definition of gambling is something that someone else does, but you don't. And I think that's really playing out here. So again, we can't just ask people if they gamble because that's not necessarily telling us anything. Being on a survey or in a treatment situation or an employee assistance program, whatever, we have to ask about specific activities to know whether or not they're having gambling. Okay, so that is a very, very quick tour through the 2021 NGAGE study. There will be a formal lengthy report that will be posted on ncpgsurvey.org. Once it is available, I estimate that's going to be in the next couple of months. And thank you for choosing this as a way to start your conference experience. If you have any questions that we haven't been able to answer, if you want to discuss this further, I'd love to know your thoughts. You can find me at donfeeney@comcast.net. And were there any questions that we should be dealing with before we have to sign off in like the next 3 or 4 minutes?
Yeah, Don, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really eye-opening. We had some folks ask before if, when you were discussing cryptocurrencies, if that included Bitcoin.
We did not ask that specifically.
Okay.
Or the question would have been a paragraph rather than a question.
I want to say, while we still have everybody here, thank you to Ashley, our ASL interpreter, for having us, or for interpreting for us today. I want to open the floor. Does anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask Don while we have him.
They want tomatoes, Then I want salt on them both. Salt.
Okay.
Do you have a question?
And then lettuce, black olive.
Okay, does anybody else have a question?
Anything in the chat that we should have gotten to and didn't?
I submitted one, and pardon my ignorance, but what's the difference between esports and virtual sports?
Okay, esports, basically you're betting on how well someone else performs on a game. Virtual sport, and that can, and that is basically, the Call of Duty, League of Legends. Basically, it's the same as betting on if you're betting on the Knicks to beat the Sixers on a basketball game. You're betting on a team playing League of Legends to beat another team playing League of Legends. Virtual sports, you are the participant, and it's basically a simulated, say, football game where it's where you are actively managing the players and making making the decisions for that the manager or the coach would normally be making during the game. You are an active participant. It's something that used to be heavily done on board games where you'd roll dice or spin a wheel to determine the outcome, and now it's something that you can do as a computer game.
Thank you.
Just want to remind everybody that slides will be available after the conference, so you will be able to see all this information. Now that we are just about at 12 o'clock, I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you do have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the chat box, to Don's email. We'd be happy to get you guys connected. If we don't have any other questions, I think that's it for today. Thank you so much.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Sure, it may have been answered earlier, but what is positive play?
Okay, yeah, and I wish I had time to get into that more. Positive play, it's basically it's an indicator that was developed by Dr. Richard Wood and some others out of Montreal, where instead of focusing on what people are, about maladaptive gambling, let's see how many people are actually gambling in what we would call a positive way. Do they understand the realities of gambling? Do they understand that it's not a good way to make money? Do they understand that playing more doesn't help you to win? Do they believe that it's their responsibility to only gamble with money left over after they pay their bills? And he has a whole index developed around that, and it's well. If a place you have an opportunity to do a positive play survey, I would recommend that. But and I could only touch on it with a few of the indicators here.
Thank you, Don.